Welcome, everybody. I am Ed Lengel. I am Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum. And I am delighted to join you today with Lesley Blume, who is the author of Fallout, the Hiroshima Cover-Up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Lesley Blume is a Los Angeles-based journalist, author, and biographer. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Paris Review, among many other publications. Her last nonfiction book, Everybody Behaves Badly, was a New York Times bestseller. Fallout is obviously a very timely work as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think all of you will find this an extremely interesting, innovative, investigative work of one of the most important events of the 20th century. So Lesley, welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you very much to the team of the World War II Museum for inviting me to this presentation, and especially on this important and somber anniversary. 75 years have passed since the deadliest global conflict in human history ended, and yet historians are still uncovering crucial information about what happened in every theater, every city, town, and region around the world during the war. And even though I was fortunate to have uncovered many revelations in my own research, which took place on 3 continents in 4 languages, I still feel that my research and translation team and I only uncovered really the tip of the iceberg of my topic. For example, we were told by a veteran archivist at NARA that an estimated 1 to 3% of records from SCAP, which is General Douglas MacArthur's occupation operation in Japan, has survived and is cataloged at NARA. And I can only imagine what was lost. I can also only, be ecstatic over what we did find, because what was in that 1 to 3% was extremely illuminating. That said, there was still considerable relevant material about the occupation, and we were incredibly lucky again to find what we did find, and I eagerly wait to see what future scholars discover in those boxes. My book Fallout, which was released just earlier this week, documents how the US government and occupation forces downplayed, spun, and covered up the true atomic aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how one reporter, John Hersey of the New Yorker magazine, was able to get the true story and reveal it to the world. So it seems ironic that the New Yorker was the media outlet to break the greatest investigative story of the war. I mean, after all, the magazine was founded as a sophisticated niche humor magazine in the 1920s, and it was deemed too, quote, inessential during World War II to merit a higher paper quota, although it had dispatched correspondents all over the world. And especially since every major news operation had a presence in Japan, since day one of the occupation, it makes it all the more ironic. Those operations had, therefore squandered their own opportunities to get into Hiroshima and Nagasaki and report on the human toll there, as well as the truth about the US's experimental new mega weapons, namely that they were the weapons that continued to kill long after detonation. So today I'll give you the broad strokes of the story behind Hersey's New Yorker article, which was titled Hiroshima. And it's still widely considered to be the most influential work of written investigative journalism ever created. And it has also played its own role in ensuring that nuclear weapons have not been used in nuclear warfare since 1945. I approached this subject as a journalist covering another journalist. And one of the main questions going into the research was just how on earth did Hersey get the story in the first place? It's a logistical question. Hiroshima had been designated a restricted topic by occupation forces, and same for anything pertaining to nuclear matters in general by the US government, even after wartime censorship had officially ended in the autumn of 1945. And by the time Hersey got into Japan in May 1946, the country was essentially on total lockdown by General MacArthur's forces. And as war correspondents have long known, whoever controls the ground controls the story. Initially, the US government appeared to be like almost ecstatically forthright about its new weapon. And therefore, the story of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima has kind of a strange distinction of being one of the most covered stories in history and also one of the most covered up. When US President Harry S. Truman announced that the world's first atomic bomb had just been dropped on Hiroshima, he pledged that if the Japanese did not surrender, they could, quote, expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on Earth, end quote. The bomb, a nearly 10,000-pound uranium bomb dubbed Little Boy, had packed an explosive payload equivalent to more than 20,000 tons of TNT, as we see here advertised on the front page of the New York Times the following day. And the president revealed that it was by far the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. Reporters and editors, given text of this presidential announcement in advance, received news with just total disbelief. Young Walter Cronkite, then a United Press war reporter based in Europe, upon receiving a bulletin from Paris about the bomb, said later that he, quote, clearly thought that the French operators getting him that information had made a mistake. So I changed the figure to 20 tons, end quote. Soon as updates to the story came in, quote, my mistake became abundantly clear, end quote. And also it seemed at first that the press was adequately reporting on the fate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in reality, even though the media coverage of the bombings had been initially widespread and intense, details of the human toll and experience amidst the aftermath were actually quite scarce from the beginning, thanks to US government and military efforts to control information about their handiwork in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States, which had just won a painfully earned moral and military victory over Axis powers, had already been quite concerned that it might, quote, get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities, as the country's Secretary of War put it, after the firebombing of Tokyo and outsized death tolls there earlier that year. Right away, officials in Washington, D.C. and newly arrived occupation forces in Japan, they went into overdrive to contain the story of the human cost of their new weapon. Before Allied troops came ashore, the Japanese media had been reporting widely on the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and disturbing reports began to filter over to the United States about the radiation killing off blast survivors in the most agonizing manner. The timing couldn't have been worse. US forces were converging upon the Japanese islands, preparing to move tens of thousands of occupation troops into the country, including the atomic cities. Then, on August 31st, 1945, more than 3 weeks after the Hiroshima bombing, the New York Times ran an account by the first Western journalist to get into that city. Former United Press, i.e. UP, journalist Lesley Nakashima, who had before the war possessed both American and Japanese citizenship and had been stranded in Japan for the duration of the war, had gotten into Hiroshima on August 22nd. 5 days later, UP, the wire service, ran his eyewitness account of what he had seen in that city. The city of 300,000 had vanished, Nakashima reported. Not a single building had been left standing intact. Hiroshima was a horrific landscape of rubble and ash. Nakashima also reported that Little Boy had not finished its handiwork on August 6th. Blast survivors, quote, continue to die daily from burns suffered from the bomb's ultraviolet rays, he reported, adding that, quote, the majority of cases at surviving hospitals are held to be hopeless, end quote. As occupation troops arrived at the end of August, they worked quickly to put an end to such reports, but not with total success. Australian war reporter Walter Burchett, correspondent for London's Daily Express, managed to get away from the troops that he had arrived with, make his way into Hiroshima and file a horrifying report which ran under the all-caps headline, The Atomic Plague. It was his warning to the world, he wrote, confirming Nakashima's report of total devastation and also that a sinister disease X was painfully killing blast survivors. When he eventually returned to Tokyo, sick and exhausted, he was hospitalized, and while he was there, his camera film containing images of Hiroshima mysteriously disappeared, and he also found that his press accreditation had been revoked. Burchett's report had been horribly embarrassing to the US, but occupation officials were able at least to intercept another, or what would have been another equally devastating report from Nagasaki, which American reporter George Weller of the Chicago Daily News attempted to file. It was intercepted and quote unquote lost. Occupation forces quickly corralled remaining press, and there were then hundreds of foreign correspondents coming into Japan to cover the September 2nd surrender ceremony into what Burchett called a press ghetto in Yokohama, a port city near Tokyo and the point of entry for occupying troops. From then on, SCAP had strict control over which reporters could enter the country and whether they could travel around it. Eventually, they were able to come from Yokohama to Tokyo, but their leashes were pretty short. Occupation forces kept tabs on reporters, their political dispositions, what they were writing, even their health. SCAP controlled the gasoline and the food, so if you as a reporter had any intention of traveling around the country or eating, you were under thumb. SCAP also had enacted a strict press code corralling the Japanese media. The Japanese weren't even allowed to mention Hiroshima in poetry, much less a press report, lest they, quote, disturb the public tranquility, end quote. Meanwhile, the US government had an inside job reporter helping them to downplay the effects of the bombs. And the New York Times had a gentleman named William Lawrence, who was nicknamed in the industry as Atomic Bill, an old guard science reporter who was well versed in atomic matters. And he had been secretly hired away from the New York Times by Manhattan Project head Lesley Groves. He had personally picked him that previous spring. Atomic Bill was henceforth to function as sort of an official in-house historian of the evolution of the bomb, and even create PR materials, including fake obits of the Manhattan Project principals in case their bomb testing went horribly wrong and wiped them out. The project still had to remain secret. So once General Groves and the other US officials began a PR campaign to deny early reports that Japanese blast survivors were dying of radiation, Atomic Bill played a role in presenting that narrative to the American public. General Groves carted Atomic Bill in a junket of other reporters to the New Mexico testing site. And the desert sand around the epicenter of that blast had been transformed essentially into a sleek green glass by the heat of the detonation, and radioactivity did linger due to the low height of the detonation. Yet Atomic Bill duly reported that the area was completely safe, and that Japanese reports of radiation-induced deaths in that country were, quote, Tokyo tales. Groves continued the downplay and the denial of bomb radioactivity PR campaign throughout that fall. And even when he did concede in front of a congressional committee that some in Japan may indeed have died from radioactivity received during the bombing, that radiation poisoning was actually, quote, a very pleasant way to die. Meanwhile, with news from Hiroshima and Nagasaki successfully suppressed, the atomic cities moved off front pages and with surprising rapidity became, quote unquote, old stories. The US was prevailing in its campaign and therefore maintaining its hard-earned moral high ground. That said, the government did want to give the bomb some publicity. After all, the United States was currently enjoying a nuclear monopoly and wanted to remind its allies and its enemies and its frenemies of this nuclear dominance. Having the bomb gave the US enormous hand of God power, which was lost on no one, especially the Soviets, who were now at a great disadvantage. To that end, General Groves estimated that it would take anywhere from 5 to 20 years for the Soviets to get the bomb. Surprise, it only took 4. But the US did allow photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's mushroom clouds to be published, along with aerial shots of the extensive landscape devastation, just to remind everyone of how powerful the weapon was. But what was missing from these photos, of course, were images of human victims. What had the bombs done to human beings living in the cities that had been attacked? And support in the US for the bombings that remained extremely high. There was, as one contemporary put it, a 4th of July attitude about the bombings. And in a survey taken in 1945, nearly a quarter of the Americans surveyed stated that they wished that the US could have, quote, used many more bombs on Japan, end quote, before that country had surrendered. Reporter John Hersey, who was in New York when the Hiroshima bombing was announced, had conflicted feelings about Hiroshima's bombing. On the one hand, he was absolutely in despair over the scale of death, and he felt fear about the world's future. On the other hand, he did feel that the bombing was likely going to end the war. But then when the US bombed Nagasaki 3 days later, Hersey was horrified. In his opinion, it was a totally criminal action, his words. He felt that the US had not given Japan sufficient time to respond before killing tens of thousands of people, mostly civilians, and he knew right away that he was going to eventually write about the atomic bombings. He just didn't know at first in what capacity. Then in late fall 1945, Hersey had lunch with the New Yorker's deputy editor, William Shawn, who's one of my favorite protagonists in this story. Shawn was small in stature, quiet. Practically, some people have described him as diminutive to the point of near invisibility, but he also had a really powerful charisma. And one the old guard New Yorker editor told me that people would sit down in front of him and just burst into tears. One of Shawn's sort of very powerful overriding beliefs was that every human life was sacred. And once his mistress and journalist Lillian Ross grilled him on this belief, because she couldn't fathom that it was all encompassing, and she asked him, even Hitler, and he replied, even Hitler. And over lunch, Hersey and Shawn discussed Hiroshima and concluded that something was off about the coverage of the post-bomb city, or rather the lack of coverage was disturbing. And given that it had been the site of only one of 2 nuclear attacks in history, it had disappeared from headlines with suspicious rapidity, they felt. Furthermore, they mutually realized what coverage there had been in the early days had really been about landscape and building devastation, not the human toll and the suffering there and what the bomb, again, had done to human beings. To be fair, Hersey conceded the aerial shots of the landscape devastation had been breathtaking, especially when one considered that it had been wrought by one single primitive bomb. But he felt rubble was impersonal. And anyway, the world was essentially numb to imagery of rubble after more than half a decade of such rubble pictures of cities around the globe. It's unclear whether Hersey and Shawn knew the extent of the restrictions that had been imposed on Tokyo-based reporters, but they likely had some idea, because the American journalism world was then very close-knit, and many of Hersey's wartime friends and colleagues were posted to Japan to cover the occupation, and he would have had some sense of the restrictions. So Hersey and Shawn decided that Hersey would try to get into Japan and write about what happened, quote, not to buildings, but to human beings, as Hersey put it. If the heavyweight media operations either would not or could not undertake the story, the New Yorker would try. For this team, it was time to learn and reveal the reality of the bombs that had been detonated in the name of country, democracy, and decency itself. So when I first came to this topic, I had suspected that Hersey had likely gotten into Japan, reported his story and then gotten out again, undetected by General MacArthur's forces. After all, the story of Hersey's success with Hiroshima has been told. But again, there's never really been any attempt to research and tell the story of how he had gotten in. And only when I really started researching General MacArthur's dominion in Japan did I realize how impossible it would have been for any journalist 8 months into the occupation to try to access the country solo. So even the first in reporters, including Wilfred Burchett and George Weller, who were combative as hell with General MacArthur's press relations people, had to accompany Allied military forces into the country as accredited war correspondents, or as embeds, as we would call them today. And they'd been able to take advantage of the chaos of those early days to break off from their respective military units. But both of them had to conjure up really elaborate schemes to get away from their minders. So, Burchett, for example, had faked a case of acute diarrhea to get away from his press minder, to leave him alone, and then took off for Hiroshima. Weller escaped his base under the cover of darkness and then impersonated an American military officer to get Japanese officials to help him reach Nagasaki. And on a side note, I have to say, I love these guys. By the time Hersey was trying to access Japan, months later, SCAP wielded near total control over who could enter Japan. And everybody had to be vetted and cleared for entrance, and then vetted and cleared to travel around the country. And you were only given an allotted time to go to specific destinations within Japan. So Hersey was not going to be able to sneak in. He had to apply for clearance. And this is where he differed from reporters like Weller, who had been butting heads with MacArthur's wartime censors for years. So as I put it in Fallout, Hersey was a perfect Trojan horse candidate to be admitted to the country. His own wartime record would have made him seem kind of, relatively innocuous. He would have looked like a perfect, unthreatening ally to MacArthur's public relations team. He had been a team player throughout the war as a reporter. He'd played by the rules as an accredited war correspondent. He had written glowing profiles of members of the military, including a quite laudatory early wartime biography of General MacArthur and his forces in Bataan, with the help and the approval of the War Department. Hersey later said that he wished that he could take the book out of print because it had been too laudatory. But, when you're applying for clearance to get into MacArthur's Japan, this is probably quite a helpful asset. So Hersey's chances at getting cleared looked better than average. Hersey began his reporting trip in China and applied there for clearance to Tokyo. Luckily for him, it was indeed granted, along with military transport into Japan. However, just because he'd been granted entry did not mean that he was given free rein. Not only was SCAP monitoring him, as they closely monitored everyone in the Occupation Press Corps, but Tokyo-based FBI operatives and the FBI in DC were appraised of his arrival, and he was going to have to tread carefully. It may seem miraculous when I tell you that he was given permission to travel briefly to Hiroshima for a limited time as well. Access again to the atomic cities was still restricted, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained restricted topics. But a few factors helped get Hersey access. First of all, his timing was good. The US government and occupation forces now felt that they had resolutely contained the aftermath story for so many months that, again, Hiroshima was seen as an old story. The public had moved on, and just as important, the press had moved on. Even if reporters had chafed about being restricted over Hiroshima and Nagasaki that previous fall, now there were new scoops to vie for in Japan, new developments to cover, the rise of communism there. There was a war crimes trial going on in Tokyo. So the government, or the occupation forces, likely thought that a journalist of Hersey's stature probably wouldn't be interested in covering in any significant way such a, quote, old story. And occupation forces had been allowing journalists into Hiroshima in recent months, but mostly to report on how quickly the city was staging a comeback. There were indeed earlier that spring some more nothing to see here stories, including one that the New York Times ran, noting that the population had returned, they were planting gardens in the ruins, things weren't so bad. So it's not entirely surprising that Hersey was allowed a glimpse in. Let's just say that the occupation officials who greenlighted his passage there would soon regret this decision. Still, Hersey and William Shawn decided that it was best that Hersey quietly collect his reporting and hightail it back to the US to write the story, away from MacArthur's censors. When he did arrive in Hiroshima, Hersey was appalled and terrified by the devastation there, even many months later. And let's not forget, Hersey was a seasoned war correspondent. He had seen it all in various theaters of camps, from combat to concentration camps. He was stunned that all of this destruction had been wrought by a single primitive bond. And all that chirpy reporting about Hiroshima making a comeback, well, Hersey found a starving, impoverished population that was essentially living in metal shanties on the ruins. And as for those gardens, some flora was indeed staging a comeback at that point, but they had apt names like feverfew and panic grass. Hersey vowed to work as quickly as he could. He made inroads. He found several dozen blast survivors who were willing to speak with him about their experiences being on the receiving end of nuclear warfare on August 6, 1945. He had the help of a German priest who spoke Japanese, and also of a Japanese pastor who had been educated in the US and spoke English. Each of the testimonies he heard was uniquely terrifying. Hersey had ultimately decided he would tell the story of 6 of them, again, just regular folks whose paths had overlapped on that horrible day. This may seem like an obvious approach now, but it was then revolutionary. Much of the story of the bomb had been told in terms of this, eye of God, end of days might, not from an individual's point of view. And Hersey realized that, not everybody can comprehend the physics of how the atomic bomb worked, or maybe, not everybody could visualize, an all-out nuclear war. But any reader could put him or herself into the shoes of a few regular folks, going about their business, early one morning, going to work, feeding their children, reading a newspaper, and so on, when catastrophe strikes. Hersey wanted readers to experience the disaster through the eyes of these 6 humans, because for him, it was imperative that he bring out the human aspect of the bombing and wrestle the story back from clinical casualty statistics. Americans in the world still had yet to comprehend and face what had happened there, and this was a possible way to get them to do so. So Hersey he had a very limited time given to him by SCAP in Hiroshima, and luckily he found his protagonists pretty quickly. One was a young widow with 3 children. Another was a young female clerk. There was a young Japanese medic, and a Japanese doctor with his own small hospital, and the German priest and the Japanese pastor who had been helping him translate and make inroads among survivors. He had only been given a couple of weeks on the ground in Hiroshima by occupation authorities, which was actually an extraordinary amount of time, but still not a great amount to do reporting of this scope. And as he was leaving Hiroshima, he thought of one of his protagonists, Miss Sasaki, the young clerk. And when the bomb had gone off, it had crushed the building that she was in, and bookshelves collapsed on top of her, mutilating one of her legs and trapping her. She was nearly crushed to death. And Hersey's on the train stations, which was somehow partly intact, waiting to leave Hiroshima. And he thought about how ironic it was, for a woman to be nearly felled by books in the first moments of the atomic age. He knew that he was going to have to put that into his manuscript. And then he began his long trip back to the US. Hersey did write Hiroshima, as his article was eventually titled, back in New York City, and edited it in extreme secrecy with New Yorker writers William Shawn and Harold Ross. Almost no one else at the magazine was allowed to know what they were working on. Other employees and contributors were even kept working on a dummy issue of the New Yorker. For Hersey and his editors, the Hiroshima writing was akin to their own Manhattan Project. The pressure on them was enormous. They knew how huge and contentious this story was going to be. It was going to confront countless Americans who had been convinced that the US was on the moral high ground in the bombings. It was going to embarrass the US and jeopardize that moral high ground. It would also reveal how much the government had covered up about the bombings and the nature of the bombs themselves and what they did to humans. Even depicting the Japanese victims themselves in human terms was going to be controversial after years of widespread wartime depictions of them as animalistic subhumans. The story was nearly done when an awful obstacle arose. President Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act, which had a restricted data provision barring anyone from revealing what the government considered to be proprietary information about atomic weapons. Those deemed in violation of the act could go to jail or worse. Hersey and the New Yorker editors now had to make an agonizing decision. They could run the story without War Department vetting and run the risk of being in violation of the act, or they could submit the story to the War Department for vetting and censorship, which is an editorial team's worst nightmare. I don't want to give away what decision they made, because this chapter and information is one of the bigger revelations in my book, and also because my publisher would kill me. But let's just say that General Lesley Groves himself got involved at this stage. He appears to have found some cynical utility in Hersey's reporting on the agonies inflicted by the weapon whose creation he had spearheaded, and certain advantages to having something like Hersey's article in the world. I suspect you all know by now that Hersey's report did indeed run, which was no small miracle, and it took up the entire contents of the August 31st, 1946 issue of the New Yorker. There it is. The international public relation was, quote, explosive, which is how Hersey put it, not me. I tried very hard not to use that word throughout my book. But Hersey was right, essentially right in this characterization. And again, I don't want to give away too much about the fallout of his reporting, but in the broad strokes, here is what shook out. Firstly, Hiroshima basically stopped America in its tracks. Readers across the country were transfixed and horrified as they were transported into the experience of August 6, 1945, and the awful days that followed. Secondly, the government's cover-up was indeed revealed. Editorials and readers across the country demanded to know what else had been concealed from them. And the government was put very much on the defensive. The record needed to be set straight, said President Truman privately, although he never would comment publicly in Hiroshima, beyond stating that he, quote, never read the New Yorker because it only made him mad. Efforts were made to put the genie back into the bottle via a factually challenged and evasive retort article, ostensibly authored by former Secretary of War Henry Stimson, but really co-authored by what one biographer put as the old boy War Department network. And this article, which appeared in Harper's, was ostensibly set out what they considered to be, what the government considered to be its completely sensible reasons for dropping the bomb. And it never did. It was, again, factually challenged, and it set some consciences at ease, but it never mentioned the cover-up, and it never even mentioned the word radiation. And it could never erase the images of the reality of nuclear warfare that Hersey had presented to the world. And finally, and this is a less likely part of the narrative, how the Soviets reacted to Hersey's Hiroshima. In a nutshell, they hated it. They hated Hersey, and they tried to smear him as an American spy who had been trying to sow panic in advertising the Americans' new mega weapon. And they did something kind of rather astonishing to rebut Hersey's findings in Hiroshima via sending a journalist, I put journalist in quotes, of their own to Nagasaki to rebut his findings. Apparently, Moscow was not enjoying its current, albeit temporary, nuclear disadvantage vis-a-vis their former wartime allies. It's also worth noting that the press was also showed up by Hiroshima, because Hersey did, after all, implicitly highlight their failings too, because none of the big news operations with all of their resources had gotten the story. The New York Times was perhaps shown up worst of all. I mean, after all, it had run the Tokyo Tales coverage by Atomic Bill Lawrence, coverage which ironically helped him to win the Pulitzer Prize that year for his overall reporting on the bomb. Yet, for the most part, with some flagrant exceptions, press was gracious, and many reporters and editors even marveled at Hersey's coup. That included the New York Times. And even though Hersey's Hiroshima was more than 30,000 words long, which is incredibly long for a news magazine story, it was reprinted in publications around the globe and read aloud in its entirety on ABC and the BBC. At least 500 radio stations covered the story in this country alone. As one correspondent put it at the time, even if you hadn't read it, it was all you were talking about. Hersey's Hiroshima remains the most influential work of written investigative journalism ever created, and it regularly tops journalism best-of lists. Earlier this year, I was talking to Carl Bernstein of Washington Post Watergate reporting fame, who noted benevolently that Hersey was always above him and Bob Woodward on those best of journalism lists. So before we go to questions, I just wanted to state my reasons for writing Fallout in the first place in this particular moment in time. And obviously the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Japan provides a natural moment to look back at this moment and investigate the story of how those bombings were told to the world, both by those who perpetrated the attacks and by those who were on the receiving end of them. Experts say that we are currently in a more perilous nuclear landscape than at any other time in the past 7.5 decades. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has, in early 2020, set its doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight, i.e. a nuclear apocalypse. That's the closest it's ever been set to midnight. They think it's an even more perilous moment in history than 1953, which was the nadir of the Cold War, the year the Soviets detonated their first hydrogen bomb. Against this backdrop, it felt imperative to revisit the quiet but powerful voices of Hersey's 6 protagonists again, 6 of the only humans in history to witness and survive the horrors of nuclear attack. Hersey long felt that what had long kept a nuclear attack from happening was the memory of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And obviously, he played a huge initial role in immortalizing that memory. I mean, let's not forget that the Japanese could not speak for themselves for years until after the occupation ended. Hersey was the first one to really get the world to pay attention, to understand what nuclear warfare really looked like. But, you know, Hersey was proud of the role that he played in immortalizing the memory of what happened at Hiroshima, but he was growing worried, even, you know, back in the 1980s when the Cold War was surging again, that memories of Hiroshima were growing thin, and that this was going to reduce Hiroshima's potency as a deterrent. Now, decades later, even in this scary and cacophonous landscape, we need to heed that memory again. And on another front, on a personal front, you know, I have long been a newsroom obsessive. I've really honestly spent most of my life since childhood in newsrooms or in proximity to them. My dad was a newsman. He was a writer and a speechwriter for Walter Cronkite, who was then deemed the most trusted man in America. I mean, as a teenager, while my contemporaries were watching Beverly Hills 90210, I was watching things like All the President's Men. All of my college internships were in newsrooms. I wrote my graduate thesis on media coverage during the first Gulf War. I've worked in journalism, both broadcast and print, since my college years. My husband is a 1A attorney who represents journalists. And over the past 4 years, I frankly have felt, you know, disgusted by enemy of the people attacks on our free press by our own president and his followers. And the accusations have felt deeply personal and insulting. And as I sought the topic of my next nonfiction project, I knew that I wanted to tell a historical story about a work of journalism that proved how profoundly essential our free press is to our common good, and how crucial the press is as a pillar of our democracy, which was in great peril when Hersey was covering World War II and is imperiled again today. The story of John Hersey and his Hiroshima article was a perfect example of that, and I honestly still can't believe that it has never been properly investigated and told before. Luckily, even though Hersey hated publicity, he left a substantial archive of professional and personal records at Yale, his alma mater, and ditto for the New Yorker, whose editors also knew early on of the historical value of Hiroshima and its backstory. They saved many of their articles, they saved many of their records of the project, which are now at the New York Public Library, although regrettably some of them are now missing also. With my last book, my Hemingway book, finding new material was like scratching water from rocks. But with this project, it was absolutely the opposite. I couldn't believe the avalanche of material that we uncovered in research. And I strongly believe that, you know, as a biographer, you choose your subject, but sometimes it chooses you too. And I'm so proud of this book and incredibly proud of the team of researchers and translators who helped me. And I am grateful that we also have the example of somebody like John Hersey, not only as a journalist, but as someone who embodies conscience and decency. It seems like a good time to bring some of that back into the world.
Thank you, Lesley, for your presentation, and it really sounds like a fascinating book, Fallout. I think just very briefly what I'd like to discuss with you is kind of set it in the context of what it would have been like for Hersey to be a journalist in 1946, because in so many ways it sounds like he was cutting against the grain, not just of what the government wanted to be revealed or not to be revealed, but also against kind of popular feeling in many ways. We look back on that time with hindsight, and I think we've come so far away from it now that it seems like everybody was celebrating the end of the war and there was nothing but happiness and prosperity and looking forward boldly into the future. But it was not like that at all. It was a very frightening time to be alive. Yes. I often tell people, if you want a sense of what it was like to be an American in those days, watch that magnificent movie, The Best Years of Our Lives, you know, because Americans were living through a time of economic dislocation, fear of what it was going to be like, all of these veterans returning home and trying to readjust, of a world, much of the world was in ruins, the fear of new enemies on the horizon, the beginnings of the Red Scare and everything. And you think of it from that perspective, nobody wants to hear about the suffering, the long-term suffering that people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are going to be enduring. That isn't, a reporter doesn't look at it from the point of view like this is what people are going to want to hear. He's
Well, no, yeah, nobody wanted to hear it, and not just for the reasons that you were describing just then, but I mean it was also extreme anxiety about the post-war landscape, but also there was still atrocity fatigue from having just been, privy to and participating in, again, the deadliest conflict in human history. I mean, people were tapped out. They could only take so much more. And, even, they were encouraged, at least Americans were encouraged right away to look forward. And even though, it wasn't entirely, they weren't feeling entirely optimistic, many of them were, only too glad to leave the horrors of the war behind. So, for Hersey, a year later, when people had really tried to start rebuilding and weren't looking back in that same way, to reintroduce the story of enormous suffering inflicted by our government, it was a brave thing to do and an unlikely thing to do. And not a lot of his colleagues were attempting to do anything like that.
You think about it from the point of view of a reporter. There's one thing for a reporter to say, I'm going to find stories that people want to hear. It's another thing to say, I'm going to pursue the truth, as John Hersey did, to determine the truth and report it to the world, whether they want to hear it or not. And it must have taken great courage for him to do that. How did he think about it?
Well, I mean, look, the calculus of like, do people want to hear this story, or not? That was never a part of their reasoning. When I say that, I mean Hersey and his editors. In the opinion of Harold Ross, who was the founder of the New Yorker, there were enormous number of atrocity stories from World War II that were going disturbingly untold because, first of all, there were too many of them to have covered in real time. And secondly, the public was moving on too quickly to have an appetite for it. But, with this particular story, they realized the enormity of it. And it wasn't, they weren't being led by public appetite. They were being led by journalistic conscience. This story was going to be told, come hell or high water, or at least they were going to try as hard as they could. It was, again, considered to be, the story of the atomic bomb was considered by journalists of that time and editors of that time to be the biggest story, not just of the war, but essentially of modern times, because it was basically the story that humans had finally invented the means with which to eviscerate human civilization. But the story hadn't been told completely enough. And if you're a reporter and you're an editor and you see an opportunity to get in and to tell, probably the most crucial aspect of that story, what it does to human beings and what it portends for civilization, then it's like they felt that they had a moral obligation to try. Which is probably why it was especially excruciating for them to have to, having gotten the goods, the reporting goods, to be able to tell the story and tell it in a way that people would not ignore it, because there was enormous incentive to ignore a story like this, for them to have to then submit it, be threatened with having to submit it to the War Department for censorship would have been especially horrible for them.
Seems to me like John Hersey is a great example for people to look up to, whether they be journalists or not. Would you feel that way?
I mean, look, it's been really nice for the last 4 years to be spending time with John Hersey, especially given, our current political landscape. I mean, he's an extremely decent fellow. And to see somebody who is led by a barometer of decency, with that as a North Star, it's been quite a balm. But what does it say about our current landscape that for me, for the last 4 years, that my big refuge has been, disappearing into a story about nuclear holocaust, for God's sake.
Well, thank you very much. Lesley Blume, author of Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up, and The Reporter Who Revealed It to the World. A wonderful presentation, and it sounds like a great book.
Thank you so much. So grateful to be here.